My name is Howard Vogel. Today I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee at the law offices of Paine, Tarwater, Bickers, and Tillman. This morning I have the great pleasure of interviewing Donald Franklin Paine, known to all Tennesseans as a lawyer's lawyer. This interview is occurring as a part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Please sit back and enjoy some time with Don. Good morning, Don.
Morning, Howard.
What is your full name?
Full name is Donald Franklin Paine.
Were you named for some member of your family?
Donald came from my father's middle name. I may have known at one time, but I frankly don't recall if I did, whether Franklin was a family name. And Dad was always insistent that we let people know, especially in this part of the world, that Paine is properly spelled P-A-I-N-E.
Duly noted.
That's right. It's usually spelled, as you know, in these parts with a Y instead of an I, but in the Shenandoah Valley where he was brought up, it was I is the prevalent spelling. So that's the way he spelled it and the way I spell it.
Where were you born?
Born right here in Knoxville, Tennessee. By hearsay says I was born at Fort Sanders Hospital.
And on what day?
And also by hearsay, it was April 29, 1939.
Tell us a little bit about your parents.
My father, as I say, was born up in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, up around Stanton, and but moved with his family, I think, when Dad was fairly young. He was, I believe, the second youngest in a fairly large group of children, and his father and mother moved to Knoxville. And then my mother, I think her ancestors came from the Ohio area, but she was born and raised in Knoxville as well. They went to old Knoxville High School, where everybody in the city went, virtually. You know, went to Central if you were in the county, but that's where they went to school and met there and knew each other for a good bit of their lives.
What was your dad's name?
Okay, he was Henry Donald Paine, but everybody called him by the nickname Buck.
And what was your mother's name?
And her name was Emily Simpson Paine. People called her Emily.
Do you have siblings?
Only one, sister 4 years younger, and that's Julie. She's now Julie Paine Fritz, married to Don Fritz, a very fine person.
Where do they live?
Well, that's an interesting question, Howard. For years, Julie lived in the Richmond area. Was a successful businesswoman, and her husband, Don, is quite successful also in business. But they are in, I would call it probably semi-retirement now. They have a couple of grown daughters, and I think Don has, well, Julie has 2 daughters by her former marriage, as Don has 3, I think. But they now have a condo at Virginia Beach. They have just built a ranch house in a remote part of Colorado. And just a few days ago, talking with my children, found out that they're thinking about getting a house in Richmond. So they fly back and forth between the West and the East.
In what part of Knoxville did you grow up?
Okay, initially, based on old family movies, and this would have been a year or 2 at most, I was raised on the Scenic Drive there, really just on the corner of Scenic and Kingston Pike. And then the smaller house on your right as you cut down the Scenic, that was when I think they built that house. And because I've seen pictures of Dad playing with me and out in the yard, and Mother playing with me. But they bought about half of Bearden Hill, about the east side of Bearden Hill, essentially. because Dad, even though he had a daytime job downtown, he wanted to have a farm. So despite all of their friends announcing their lunacy, they moved from the essentially Sequoia Hills area out to what was then a very desolate part of the county, and that was Bearden. I guess it's close to the center of population now, but I can tell you growing up, there was virtually nothing out there. To give you some flavor of it, I tell younger folks, they raised, of course, most of what they needed, both in the way of gardens and livestock. But if there was a rare trip Mother needed to make to the grocery store, the closest grocery store was at the corner of 17th and Cumberland Avenue. So we're talking about boondocks out there.
So you consider yourself having grown up on the farm?
I literally did grow up on the farm, and I was, asked to do some work on the farm. So,
where did you go to elementary school?
Went to Bearden. That's the old Bearden, the very oldest building in the complex. It's a mile, I guess, east of Bearden Hill. And initially, all of the classes, that being first grade through senior and high school, were in that oldest building, and it was smaller then than it is now. It's been added on to.
Did you go to a nursery school before elementary?
It wasn't a nursery school. I did go 2 years, 3 years, I guess, up to a place called Thaxton, which is still there, up closer to the university. I think that's Lake, I believe that's the address. And I guess I went to kindergarten there, first grade and second grade. That was a privately run school and still is today. Then I went to the third grade at Bearden and completed my elementary grades, junior high and part of high school at Bearden, all in that location, although the school expanded some over that time.
From the time of your youth up until, say, age 14 or 15, did you actually know any lawyers in the community?
I knew Mr. Howard Jarvis because Mr. Jarvis and his wife were friends of my parents, social friends. I knew Mr. Dick Carson, the original Carson of Hodges Daddy Carson. Again, for the same reason, Mr. Carson and his wife were social friends. So those would have been the, and I'm sure there were some others that I, had acquaintance with slightly, but those were the two that I had the most contact with.
I believe Howard Jarvis' son is in our legal community today, is he not?
Absolutely, he is a federal district judge and a very prominent one. So he was, he and his two sisters were childhood friends of mine and my sister.
What was your father's occupation?
I think early in my life, before I was aware of many things, I'm pretty sure he worked with the Post Sign Company, but at the years I remember, he was just across the river from where we're sitting right now. There was, I guess you'd call it today, a holding company, but there was by the railroad tracks over there, just down the hill from Baptist Hospital, both a Budweiser distributorship and then a Royal Crown Cola Knee-High bottling plant and distributorship. And Dad seems to have been pretty much the head of sales for both of those entities. So he seemed to work for the beer company and also for the soft drink company. So we as children always had Knee-High and RC, and Dad, Mother had the Budweiser.
As a young man and up until the time you were 15 or so, were there particular things of interest to you, hobbies or activities that were of particular interest to young Don Paine?
Howard, I really don't know that there were. I mean, we all played the childhood sports that was just sort of done in those days. Seemed like did a little camping with Dad. But a little bit of fishing. Dad didn't do much fishing, but every now and then we'd do that and take me along, and take Julie along for that matter. But not much, just kind of playing cowboys and Indians, I guess, in the fields up there. And in the adjacent areas, you know, even over in the West Hills area now, West Hills wasn't there. Everything out there was virtually cow pasture, except for the old Baum's greenhouses. That was about the only industry. There were two churches, the Presbyterian Church and the Baptist Church. Central Baptist, which is now there, and Aaron Presbyterian, which was then down where the funeral home is now, Man's Funeral Home. There was a little strip shopping center where the bank is across from Man's. It had a drugstore, variety store, barber shop, and hardware store. And the barber shop, I can remember, had a deal where for a few cents people can come in and take a shower, because a lot of folks in that area didn't have any place to bathe other than the barber shop. And they had a post office, actually had a post office in Bearden, kind of across the street between there and the school. It wasn't used much, but there was actually a very small railroad station up there by the tracks near the trestle that's there today. So that stuff in the school, and it was about it.
Who were your childhood buddies?
Jack Sharp, who's sadly deceased, later became a minister. Spent a lot of time with Jack, with the Jarvis kids I've already mentioned. Charlie Baum was a very close friend. He was of the Baum's greenhouse, one of the families that had that. Mike Rentenbach, now as you know of Rentenbach Construction, his mother and father were acquaintances of my mother and dad, and they lived over on Ridge Rock Road, which was roughly 2 ridges north of the hill where our little house was. We had an old ramshackle farmhouse. It was, the rumor always was that that mansion that still survives on the west side of Bearden Hill, which, as you know, was antebellum, that at least part of this ramshackle farmhouse the Paines occupied later was the slave quarters. In fact, I think where my bedroom and the kitchen were located, that was allegedly the slave quarters in old days. Who knows whether that was true or not, but it was just an added on to farmhouse.
Did your grandparents live in this area?
My grandfathers, I think, passed maybe in the first year of my life. They were both alive, I'm told, at my birth, but died so early I never knew either one of them. Grandmother Simpson did live in Knoxville for a long time on that corner house there where the parents stayed briefly until they could get their own little house on Scenic. And then Daddy's mother lived in the Charlottesville area, so I saw her at some family reunions, and she visited some, came down here, but did not see her as frequently as I did my maternal grandmother.
Were there any lawyers in your family?
None that I know of. No.
Were you a UT fan growing up?
Oh, mildly so, I guess. You know, it's kind of treason around here not to be. So, Dad took me to a few football games when I was young, but that was about the extent of it.
Did y'all take family vacations?
We did, and they invariably ended up at Pawleys Island, South Carolina. That's the only place Dad ever wanted to go. And of course, this was all before air conditioning. And you'd ride in that hot old car with all the windows down from Knoxville to Pawleys Island. But we went there every single summer.
Now, as I understand it, after a year or two in high school, you went off to Asheville, North Carolina.
Well, I got shipped off across the mountains to what was really sort of a glorified reform school. It was a private school for boys called Christ School for Boys in Arden, North Carolina, which is just east of Asheville. And that was to shape me up. I was goofing off at Bearden by that time, in my mother and dad's view anyway. And it was, I didn't care much for life over there, but it was good that I went because it really did, Howard, prepare me for college and got me intellectually interested in some things such as history and literature, which I later studied in college. So it was a good decision on Mother and Dad's part.
Don, I've done a little research. Christ School is affiliated with the Episcopal Church. And,
it is.
And was founded in 1900.
Wow.
So it was well equipped and prepared to receive a young, inquisitive Don Paine. Would you agree?
That's right. I was raised a Presbyterian at Aaron Church there. In fact, in my high school years, I worked construction in the summers. When I guess starting about age 16, and the first job I ever had was working for Lloyd McCamey Construction Company, building the present Aaron Church, which is located, as you know, a bit west of where it used to be at Mann's right there. So it's on the other side, kind of as close to Calhoun's on Bearden Hill, but a little bit over the rise from there. And that was my first real summer job other than just working on the farm. And I had a high office of mortar boy. And
what does a motor boy do?
Mortar boy. I would haul mortar for the bricklayers, and also a ditch digger. Next summer I worked at a school, don't know the name of it, I've gone past it before, just by chance, out in South Knoxville, but I was a ditch digger out there, ran a jackhammer. So I was a laborer and sort of enjoyed that work.
Did that work sharpen your interest in higher education?
Well, I don't know. I think I remember once going home and telling my parents I thought I would just continue in that sort of work, and I got a little bad reaction from them on that, so I think they were the ones that thought higher education would be a good idea. I even thought about going in the service, but Dad said, well, you know, you should do that at some point, but you ought to go on to college now after high school. I think he had some fear that if I went in the service and came back, maybe I wouldn't go to college. And he had only been able to go for 1 year for financial reasons, and his father died, so he had to he had to stop college and go to work. So he wanted me to go ahead and get my college out of the way, and I'm glad I did.
Christ School in Asheville is among many good prep schools in our region. How was it selected over, say, McCallie? Or
real clearly, because the Watson's family, that couple, was good friends of Mother and Dad's, and Mitchell Watson had gone there. So the Watsons were very high on Christ School, and they recommended that to my folks.
Christ School for Boys was a school for boys. Was that an adjustment for young Don Paine?
I guess so. I mean, you know, it's not, I didn't think much about that. You know.
Was there a girls' school nearby?
There was, but I never had anything. Oddly enough, I had everything to do with them. They would come over, I can't remember what it was called right now, but they had a dance every now and then, and I never seemed to learn how to dance. I still can't dance. But what I would do, because I was not wanting to fool with that kind of stuff, so what I would do is babysit the children of one of my history professors, because all the professors lived on the campus in various houses, and I did that. And so I did not learn the social graces while I was over there. Played sports, you know, because everybody did that, but as far as dances, I wasn't a dancer.
How many students in your class at Christ School?
Golly, Howard, I don't know about my class. I think the whole school probably had no more than 150 students, if that many. And that was grades 7, I think 7 through high school.
You graduated there.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any teachers of particular significance for you during that time?
Yeah, I think I had an influence on me. Mr. Mays, he certainly inspired me as far as American and English literature. And then Mr. Hand, the professor from whom I babysat, he and his wife, he was a history prof, as was Mr. McCullough, and they caused what is continuing to be a love of history. So those would be the three I would single out.
During the summers while you were a student at Christ School, did you have any summer work anywhere?
Well, it would be those summers when I was doing this stuff, such as coming home and then working down at Aaron Church one summer for Lloyd McCamey, and then the same construction company working for him at that school in South Knoxville, where I was running the jackhammer.
What did you do the summer after your graduation from Christ Church? Or Christ School?
I might have continued working for that company. I just don't remember precisely, but I think I just did more construction work.
Where did you go to college?
Went to the University of Tennessee.
And how did you happen to select UT?
Wasn't much of a choice, because at that time mother and father had, very little money, and tuition was almost nothing. I can't remember what it was at that time, but it was minuscule compared to today, certainly. So that was the place to go. I did fairly well at Christ School and could have gotten partial scholarships to some other colleges and universities, but I sort of wanted to come back to Knoxville anyway, so UT was a logical choice.
At that time, as you entered UT as a freshman, did you have any idea about what you wanted to do with your life?
I guess I had thought that I would study history and literature, and maybe because I was impressed with the folks I've mentioned at Christ School, my professors, and there were other good professors there too, that maybe end up teaching in a prep school or maybe teaching in a college. So I assumed that I would do some graduate work perhaps and end up as a full-time teacher.
What became your major in college?
My major, I think, ended up being literature, but I certainly took a lot of history as well. If I had it to do over, I probably would have switched it a little bit with either double major or major in history and minor in lit.
Did you enjoy your college experience?
For the most part, I found it. You can get a good education at University of Tennessee, even though it's not a real small school, although it was much smaller then. But if you apply yourself, there was certainly some very good professors there.
Were you a member of a fraternity?
Yeah, I was, sort of over my objection. I just didn't like the concept much of fraternities. But my father, in that brief time he was in college, had been a member of Sigma Chi, and it was very important to Dad that I become a Sigma Chi. So I did, and once I was in there, I thought, well, I might as well do something with it. So I was, seemed like I was pledge trainer one year, and some folks thought maybe I would be elected president, but by that time I had pretty much lost interest, because I think it was about that time I was going to go to law school. So I did participate some in it, but I'm still, to this day, not really gung-ho about fraternities. But I did that because Dad wanted me to.
Among your fraternity brothers, who went on to join the legal community in our state?
Oh, golly, in that group, you might have me stumped right there. I'm sure some did, but I'm not thinking.
Was Joe Mont in your fraternity?
He was ahead of me, yes. He was several years ahead of me. Joe Mont McAfee. But I just don't offhand recall. There certainly were some that did.
Were there particular professors at UT who inspired you or helped shape your interest in learning?
Yeah, Dr. Haskins was a history professor I admired very, very much. Dr. DePonte was a lit professor that I admired much, and later when we get a little further along, we'll talk about my graduate work there. And I did my graduate work under the supervision of Dr. Durant DePonte, who sadly was killed in that still mysterious plane crash up around Newport many, many years ago, back in 60s. So, but Dr. Paine and Dr. Haskins stand out. There were certainly other good professors I had. As I say, you could get a very good education if you applied yourself at the University of Tennessee. And I did have the background that I told you I had over at Reform School. So really the first year at UT was virtually a repeat of the senior year at Christ School, in a couple of situations down to the same textbook. So I was prepared, and that enabled me to do some good and actually get a little bit of scholarship money because of that.
What was it about Dr. DePonte and Dr. Haskins that made them impressive professors?
Well, they just almost like those other professors at the high school level, they just obviously had a love of the subject and love to convey that to others, to convey that knowledge. And I, as turns out, a teacher, although not on the track I was aiming for at first, I think that's so important. It's very obvious whether this teacher loves doing this or not. And these folks I've mentioned obviously did, and that caused me, to be curious and do self-study, and I think that's the role of a teacher, good teacher.
While you were a college student, did you have any part-time jobs?
I did. Certainly when I was in undergrad, I worked there at the Fraternity house. Sort of weird. I was essentially a waiter and a person who cleaned up the dining room. I was also, one year, I guess the year I was place trainer, I was required to live in the house. Randy Ayers, that's somebody who became a lawyer. Randy was a fraternity brother. So when he was president and I was place trainer, we roomed together. But one of my duties there was to get up early and come to the kitchen where they had a couple of employees from the outside that would come in and do cooking and some of the dishwashing there. But I would take the breakfast orders from the folks, and then a time or two when the snow was so bad that the hired help couldn't get in, believe it or not, old Paine was actually the cook. I did everything, and at least nobody turned down my food, so I guess it was edible.
How did you spend your summers during your undergraduate
Okay,
years?
the first couple of years, I went up to New York City. I would always, read about New York, and an old country boy wanted to see what the sights were up there. So I went up and through some contact of my father's, got a job as a lowly office boy in an advertising agency, Darcy Advertising. And I think I would have made something like $50 a week to live on up there. And but I got to see the sights, and I think we were talking before we got started here about my mother always had a love of opera, and I was more into country music, but I did, I guess her influence had an impact on me there, because when I went up there I did spend some of my time at the Anthony Amato Opera House, where you could go down to the village and see the aspiring stars perform just with a piano. And you could pay whatever you could pay. They would pass a plate around during the intermission. If you could pay a nickel, fine. If you could pay more, that was fine too. And then I saw a lot of concerts, including with Met Stars up at the Lewison Stadium open air concerts. So I did that. I went to plays. You could get standing room only for virtually nothing, just stand in the back. So I saw a lot of drama. Including Look Homeward Angel, a dramatization of Thomas Wolfe, which had an impact on me. And so I worked in New York for those summers. It was a little bit difficult. I lived at the Y the first summer. The next summer I lived at some little place up on Park Avenue where they had taken the top penthouse floor and chopped it up into little bachelor's apartments. And the apartment was about half as big as this table right here, with just a bed in there and a chest of drawers and a communal bathroom down the hall. But I made it on what little I had. You could at the old, I think it was the old Blarney Stone chain up there. You could go in, and if you would buy a dime glass of beer, and back then in New York, if you were 18, you could drink beer. And then if you just bought that much beer, you could go through this buffet. Oh my gosh, they just had all kind of very good, substantial food. So I pretty much made it on one huge midday meal, at the Blarney Stone.
There may be some watching this interview who are not acquainted with Thomas Wolfe and his connection with Knoxville. Could you help us out there?
Yeah, well, his connection's more with Asheville, but it's not the Thomas Wolfe. There's another modern author called Tom Wolfe, but this is the Thomas Wolfe who wrote back in the 20s and 30s, and he was born and raised in Asheville, and then went off to New York, green, just like I was green when I went up there. And it seemed like he taught college up there, and then wrote his novels, 4 novels. I think at least one, maybe 2 were published posthumously. But that play really had an impact on me, because that caused me to get involved in that subject on Thomas Wolfe as my master's topic later on, when I finally got into that.
Had you read his book before you saw the play?
I don't think I had, even though I had been right over there in Asheville during that time. I knew where the house was downtown, the boarding house that his mother ran, where he was raised, the old Kentucky home, which still stands today. It's been preserved. But that's odd, because there I was, in Thomas Wolfe country, but didn't pick up on the interest until some years later.
Did your work for the advertising agency stimulate any interest in the world of advertising?
Oh, no. I mean, it was just something to, it was to be in New York. That's all it was. I was just a flunky, I'd deliver stuff around to the various people in this office, and they would send me on runs down to various other offices and stuff like that. But I remember one time there was, can't remember the name of the gentleman, but he was the head of Darcy Advertising. And his secretary was real mean. I remember that. Everybody else was real nice to me, They all called me the Southerner. And, but anyway, in the mailroom, I got a call that I needed to come up and see the, chairman of the board of the company, up to his office. And I thought, well, I guess I'm going to have to go home and tell Mother and Dad I got fired. And I walked up there, and past that secretary right there, and I'm sure she was, I imagine she was thinking, well, we're getting rid of this young whippersnapper. And I went in there. It turns out that the chairman of the board of the Lehigh Corporation, and that was again with Dad, new Dad, and was up there seeing the chairman of their advertising agency, and wanted to see Buck Paine's boy. So I got in there and had a conversation with all these big people, and came back out and kind of smirked at that mean secretary.
Did you get a raise after that?
No, but I didn't get fired either.
Did you have just one summer in New York?
It seemed like I had 2. No, I had 2. Mm-hmm.
And was the second summer with the same advertising agency?
Mm-hmm, same. Mm-hmm.
Now, at this point, had the thought of becoming a lawyer entered your mind?
Not really. No, the whole thing about law school, in those days, Howard, you could go to UT Law School. You could at least get in the door over there. If you were from Tennessee and had a 2-point average, and I had a little better than that, and he completed 3 years of undergrad, didn't even have to have a degree. Now, they flunked a lot of folks out, but they would at least let you in. You didn't have to take any entrance exam or anything. And the only reason I even went over there one time was Randy Ayers, the guy I had room with. I told you about Randy was about a year ahead of me. He had gone to law school. And I woke up one morning and thought that, what if I decide I go all the way through master's, PhD in lit and history and decide I don't want to do that? There's not much else you can do. So maybe I'll at least go see what was going on at the law school. So I went over there, you know, with not much motivation, but I did go.
At this point, were you inquiring about law school before you had finished your undergraduate studies?
Right, but I still got my undergraduate degree. I got enough credits to go ahead and do that. And then, foolishly, because I was still undecided what I wanted to do, I went ahead with a master's program. So here, this crazy guy is taking a full load in law school. I was taking a master's curriculum. Cynthia and I had gotten married, I guess, after I had finished about 1 quarter. It was a quarter system, 1 or 2 quarters of law school, 2 maybe. And then she graduated from undergrad and was working for what was then called the welfare department, worked in adoption of all things. And then I worked 3 part-time jobs. 2 were library jobs where I could get a little bit of work done. One in the city-county the law library for the courthouse, let's just call it that, courthouse library, where I was paid 50 cents an hour. They didn't have to pay minimum wage. Minimum wage was probably only 60 cents, but governments didn't have to pay minimum wage. And I worked for the UT Law Library. That was 50 cents. And then my 3rd job, to show you how the tail wags the dog then, and still at UT, with the athletic department, I was a tutor over there for the athletes they were trying to keep from flunking out. And for that work, I was paid $5 an hour, 10 times more than I was paid for the other jobs. So with those 3 jobs, and then Cynthia's income, which wasn't much, we somehow survived. But I did end up getting an MA as well as an LLB, which was the law degree I got. I've never applied for a JD. I still have an LLB. I don't know why they ever use JDs, but I have a Bachelor's of Laws and a Master of Arts.
Did you tutor any All-Americans?
I don't know. I can't remember much in the way of who I tutored. But there were certainly some very good athletes I tutored.
What did an academic tutor do back in the...
Well, I never wrote a word for anybody, but I would critique their work and try to give them ideas and show them how to do it better. But I didn't write any papers for anybody, that's for darn sure.
How long did it take you to finish law school?
I went straight through because, see, I had been in ROTC in undergraduate school, so I was commissioned but had a delay in reporting for active duty. But to get that delay, I had to go 4 quarters a year, summer as well. So I don't know. I mean, I don't think I entered law school maybe not exactly after 3 years of undergrad, but I might have had 1 more quarter in addition to that. So whatever the computation would be, I was allowed to stay out of the service and finish law school, to take the bar exam. Once I got my bar results, I had to report to active duty at Fort Benning, Georgia, at the Nursery School.
Who were the law professors who made an impression?
Oh, golly, okay. So many of them were good. I just admired so much. Certainly Colonel Warner stands out, later became Dean Warner. Taught all the property courses, and I took all of those, although oddly, because I've been a trial lawyer, I never used anything in my practice that I learned there, but I thought the world of him. I told you I worked in the law library. Mr. Feerick was law librarian, and so I had a lot of fondness for Mr. Feerick, and just in our conversations generally, he was very influential with me. Pretty much by default, because it was such a small student body and the law review staff was extremely small, and I liked to write, so I wrote a lot, and by default really kind of became editor-in-chief of the law review. Well, Mr. Knoll, Professor Knoll, and then Mr. Feerick, Professor Feerick, they were the 2 faculty advisors, so because of that I spent a lot of time with them in law review work. So those are some of the ones. But again, I had with one exception I won't name. I mean, I thought all of my law professors were just good teachers, and I respected them very much.
Had you gotten to know any other lawyers in the legal community by that time other than Mr. Jarvis and Mr. Carson?
You know, not much, because I was just working, either studying or working all the time, except for the very few hours I slept. So I did not know. And then, of course, I went off to the service, and it wasn't until I got back from the service that I was able to finally get to start meeting some of the members of the legal community.
Was ROTC required while you were an undergraduate?
The first 2 years it was required, because it is a land-grant college, but then the advanced was voluntary. But again, I think Dad's the one that convinced me that as long as you're going to go in the Army, you might as well go as an officer, commissioned officer. So I went ahead and enrolled in advanced ROTC.
While you were in graduate school, both for your master's program and the law school, did you have any participation in the ROTC program?
I guess I was finished by then, so I was just on deferment then. I was finished, let's say, after my first 2 quarters in law school. I guess I had completed all of my ROTC. So the rest of the time, I just, had a second lieutenant's commission, but was deferred until I finished my legal studies.
You were a full-time law student, but also actively in a master's program. What was involved in pursuing your master's?
Well, you'd have, there was mainly seminars, and then of course you had to write a thesis as well. And you took some actual courses. So it was courses, some seminars, and then at the end you had to write a thesis. Mine happened to be on Thomas Wolfe. I remember one summer, I think it was, there was a particular English professor that wouldn't let you load up on hours as much as I wanted to, but he was gone on sabbatical or something, so I just did what I wanted to. And I remember taking, I think it was 30 hours, my total law school hours and hours on master's. I think I took 30, passed 30 hours that particular quarter.
And working
And worked 3
part-time.
jobs. And was also at least trying to be married.
Do you see a lot of law students with that kind of program today?
Well, no, and I never bring it up, but if any of my current students fuss about their workload, I just sort of have that in the back of my mind.
What was Cynthia's maiden name?
She was Cynthia Logan, Cynthia Burns Logan.
And when did you all marry?
Okay, it would have been, let's see, that would have been June the 2nd, and I guess that would have been 1961.
Did you get married here in Knoxville?
In Knoxville, at Second Presbyterian Church. We'd become members of that church by then. The building that's out on the pike, it used to be a downtown church.
As a young married couple and students at the same time, did you have friends who were at the same point in life along with you all?
Oh, yeah. Now, again, keep in mind, she was out of school, but some of our friends, though, were couples where they were both out of school because they only went to undergraduate school.
Were any of your friends at that time young lawyers in the community?
Just trying to think our group of, I'm thinking of, well, no, certainly some were law students, some of the married law students, but the others, the interest, no.
It has been said that these days some people have a little bit of fun while they're going to law school. Did you have any fun while you did?
Didn't have time to. I'm not complaining, I just, was busy.
The master's thesis, when did you complete that in relationship to the law school timeline?
I guess I finished my legal, it just so happened, I think I finished the legal studies about April of whatever year. I guess what that'd be, 63, I guess. And then, but I had to take the bar exam that summer. And then I guess the master's, I probably finished that summer because I had to finish up my thesis, so that was the reason for a little bit different time. But it was close to the same time.
Do you recall taking the bar exam?
Yeah, I mean, it was 2 days of essays. They didn't have a multi-state in those days, and Bob Crosley had started his bar review course just a few years before that, but really we were so poor that I couldn't afford to scare up. I think it had a huge tuition then of $50. I couldn't scare up $50, and I was embarrassed to ask my parents for it. So Randy Ayers, bless his heart, probably wasn't supposed to, but he had already taken it earlier since he was ahead of me and let me look at his notes, which were very thorough. So I just studied those. And for the first time, I thought this law stuff is kind of interesting, and all these different subjects kind of mesh together. Because when I was in law school, wasn't all that impressed with it. I enjoyed doing some of the writing on the law review, but I thought this is the most boring stuff I can imagine, just when I was going through school there, partly because I was having to wing it so much because of the crush of all the other things I was required to do.
While you're in law school, I guess it looked like there was a crossroads ahead. You were either going to be a literature professor or a lawyer. How did you view that at that time?
Well, I mean, when I went in the service, I need to say that when I reported for active duty, they went ahead and transferred me to the Judge Advocate General's Corps. But in those days, the Judge Advocate General required that you go to the entry school basic training, which I'd already essentially done in ROTC. So I went down to Fort Benning a while, then went up to the JAG School, which was in the same building with the University of Virginia Law School, went there to learn about military law, and then got sent out to the permanent duty station, which in my situation was Fort Rotc, Alabama. It's in southeast Alabama.
How long after your law school graduation was it that you reported for service?
Oh, well, let's don't tie it to the graduation, but tying it to the bar exam passage, and you got your results back very quickly in those days because so few people were taking the bar, and you got sworn in. Judge Taylor, Federal Judge Taylor, who was acquainted with my family, just happened to be the one I went to get sworn in. It really didn't matter who did it as long as it was a judge. And within days, I was at Fort Benning. So as soon as I was a licensed lawyer, then I had to report.
And how long was it from the bar exam to receipt of word that you passed?
I don't remember, but I mean, was it maybe a month? Maybe not that long. I just know it wasn't very long.
Did you enjoy your service in the JAG Corps?
To some extent I did, yeah. Well, and Cynthia was a school teacher right off post there. And we had some friends, obviously, that we knew and spent time with them. It was about 100 miles from the beach, which back around Panama City area, Destin, a lot of that was very undeveloped back in those days. So this would have been 64, 65. So we had a pretty good time in the service.
What was your rank designation?
When you went in JAG in those days, you were immediately made a first lieutenant. I had some time in grade anyway because I had been a second lieutenant for a couple of years, but you immediately became first lieutenant, and then usually, say halfway through your 3-year stint, you made captain unless you really goofed up. So yeah, you end up being a captain.
Did you have any interesting trial experience while in the JAG?
Not as much as I wish, because Fort Rotc was the aviation center. And this was before Vietnam was anything other than just, cowboys and Indians. It was mainly the people going over there were mainly the helicopter pilots and mechanics from Fort Rotc and the special forces. They were not sending in basic ground troops until toward the end of my 3 years in the service. So Fort Rotc is populated then by aviators, very highly skilled mechanics, a handful of lawyers, a handful of doctors, and So but those folks were pretty well behaved. So we had a little bit of white collar crime. I tried one case where my client was charged with stealing money from the officers club bingo game, you know, but in a way I wish I had been at a post where you had more, a basic training post where you had more ruffians there. You would have gotten more court-martial experience. So I did have the good luck, though. They made me the liaison with the civilian bar in southeast Alabama. So while I was not actually trying the cases, I was in a number of courtrooms in that part of the state, along with civilian lawyers. Got to know a lot of them. I had job, you know, if I'd wanted to stay in that part of the world down there, I had some pretty good job offers when I finished my service tour, but I wanted to come back home.
Did you think about staying in South Alabama?
No, I didn't. I thought very briefly about staying in the service, but then decided no, I'd serve my time. But you could, you know, if you, in those days, if you spent 20 years and retired, you would retire at half pay. You could usually be a major, maybe a light colonel after that time. And if you stayed in 30 years, you would almost surely be a bird colonel. And I think it was, what was it? I may be wrong about this. I think it was 3/4 pay after 30 years. But you could not, there were only two general slots, the judge advocate general and then the assistant to the judge advocate general. So the highest rank you could get in that branch of service realistically was a full bird colonel.
While you were in the JAG court, did you have any opportunity to use your writing skills and your enjoyment of that?
Not a lot, Howard. No, no. I remember because the one area where at UT, I think my education was lacking at the UT Law School because of the unnamed professor, was in the areas of all things evidence and civil procedure. That this particular professor, well, he was scheduled to teach, let's put it that way. So I spent my lunch hours just with a packed lunch I brought from home up in the courtroom, and these were old World War II barracks, and the courtroom was upstairs above our offices, and I just go up there by myself and take evidence texts and procedure texts and pretty much taught myself the law of evidence and the law of civil procedure, which, as you know, have been the two topics that I have primarily taught ever since. So that's not a very efficient way to learn it, but maybe it's a way to learn it real, real well, to be self-taught.
Why don't we take a break at this point and resume in just a few minutes?
Sure, very, very good.
Don, we were talking about how you became a self-taught evidence scholar while in the military. What were you considering doing after your military service?
Oh, again, it sounds like I had such a lack of purpose in my life, but I had nothing really in particular planned. So many things have been by happenstance. I, at some point, got a call from Colonel Warner, who I think may have become dean by then. And they needed somebody to come to UT and do some work in civil procedure and evidence. And I had about another year to complete those, so I couldn't, I couldn't do it then. I think Wheeler Rosenbaum actually taught maybe just 1 year at UT, and he's become a very distinguished lawyer and now judge. But anyway, that brought me back to UT for several years as a teacher. So I just kind of fell into that because they had a need for something, and by that time I was interested, I guess, enough to take them up on it.
When did you join the faculty at the UT Law School?
Okay, seemed like I was full-time over there, and I can't remember now whether they'd gone to the quarter system or not. I think it was still, I mean, the semester system. I think they were still in the quarter system. Anyway, I was there, say, from about the fall of '66 until about the spring of '70, I'm going to say, roughly. So I was probably there 3, maybe 4 academic years. And then have taught part-time, since. But at the end of that time, I went with the Edgerton firm because they wanted somebody to come do trial work, and that was the area that I had an interest in and where I could use some of my knowledge of evidence and procedure. And so I did leave and join that firm, and essentially over the years built up the trial division in what was otherwise, as you know, primarily a banking, estate, corporate law practice. So that brought me downtown to that firm.
When you came home to join the faculty at UT Law School, how did you prepare yourself to be a teacher of young law students?
I just did the best I could, and I really messed up a lot at first, but I was always one for self-critique, and I would take to heart even very harsh critiques. I would, even back then, do what I still do to this day, and that is record some lectures and listen to them and realize you got to do better on that. And so I just tried to do better, tried to learn from my mistakes.
What were some of the mistakes that young Professor Paine made?
I just think you make a whole lot of them. You're nervous and all. I mean, I wasn't all that much older than my students at that time, so it was a chore. But I think little by little, I was able to gain some respect because I at least kept trying and did a better job just because I knew I had to.
Did you have a mentor on the faculty?
Not really. You pretty much just left to your own.
During those first 4 years, you taught evidence and procedure?
I taught procedure, both state. They had a separate course on Tennessee procedure, a rather elaborate course with several quarters, and then went on federal procedure. I taught all of that, and then at some point I picked up the evidence course as well. Yeah, so.
Back at that time, I don't think we had our Tennessee Rules of Civil Procedure.
Oh, no.
So what was procedure back then?
Procedure back then was a combination of a lot of common law and some statutes. And because there wasn't really any text around, I put together a mimeographed it myself because there was no staff over there except the dean had a couple of secretaries.
Now, what is mimeograph?
Well, it was an old mimeograph machine that you hand cranked, and I mimeographed and put in these loose leaf notebooks, Tennessee cases and Tennessee statutes, and essentially wrote my own, assembled my own set of materials for the class. And it was good. I mean, the students at least had the law right there. And then about the time I was leaving out there, I guess, is when I don't remember the exact rule, but I think the rules of civil procedure hit around 1970, 71. The evidence rules, of course, were much later, around 1990. But then the rules came in, and back at that time, I was not on the Rules Commission, so I was not involved in the making or any of the drafting like I have been in recent years. So, but we had to teach common law and statutes and of course in the federal situation, we had the federal rules of civil procedure.
For state procedure back then, there were some terms of legal art that are somewhat archaic.
Oh, a whole bunch of them, and that was true in evidence too. See, evidence was just common law and some statutes, and there I eventually Ended up writing, I started it while I was at UT, but it actually didn't get completed until a few years into my private practice. But I ended up writing that first edition of the evidence book just because there wasn't anything else out there.
That was Paine on Evidence.
Well, that's what some people called it anyway.
That's what we call it.
First edition, and I had no research assistants or anything. You know, it was just 100% my work.
Now, from the academic world, why did you leave that to join a firm in private
Well,
practice?
there was just several internal reasons out there, but it wasn't going to work out for me at UT over the long haul. So this opportunity came up just before that, oddly enough, and I did, for this same foundation, interview Barry Bernstein's father, who was sort of a mentor of mine eventually in the practice of law, Bernie Bernstein. And I was going to go maybe with Bernie's firm. He had a small firm at that time, I think with Boone Dougherty and Charlie Cesano, now Judge Cesano. And then somehow this other offer came, and looked a little bit better because, again, I had a chance for the future there to grow the trial part, which was just in its infancy pretty much at Edgerton.
What was the name of the firm at that time?
Oh gosh, Edgerton, McAfee, Armistead, and Davis was the name of the firm I joined.
Who were the principals in that law firm?
Well, it was primarily at that time, you would be talking about Bill Davis Sr. and Mont Edgerton. They were both. I never knew Mont Edgerton's father, but he was the original Edgerton of Edgerton McAfee, which was formed, I think, back even around 1930, right after, as the Depression was winding down. And then I did know Mr. McAfee Sr., but he was up in years and not really that active, you know, as far as his practice anymore. But he was still in the office every day, and a very nice gentleman. So but Bill Davis Sr. and Mont Edgerton were the ones in charge of the firm.
Was Keith McCord with the firm at that time?
Keith was there too, yeah, and Keith was there a few years. Keith did some trial work, and in fact I worked some with Keith, but then he left the firm at some point, formed his own firm. I don't know how long that was after I joined it. But yes, Keith was in the firm at the time I joined.
Was there a fellow named Walker there?
Yeah, John was there. John Walker was there, and we were friends. Then he later on left and went to the Fowler firm, and at that time maybe the oldest or next to oldest law firm in Knoxville, which sadly disintegrated later. But he joined Fowler and Fowler.
Let me back up a minute. While you were at the law school as a member of the faculty, did the school provide secretarial support for you?
For the most part, the answer was no. You had to either type yourself, and I could type some in those days, or you had to hire it out, which I did a lot of. But by last year over there, somehow the Lord sent a lady sitting right here at the table with us today, who was then Miss Karen Holden. She was a minor at the time under the law. She had just graduated from Carter High School about a month before she came to UT, and she actually just came to the UT secretarial pool and by chance got assigned to law school. So she was assigned to do any work for faculty, because the dean had 2 or 3 secretaries, faculty had 0. And it was only a few of the young Turks, mainly Jerry Phillips, the late Jerry Phillips, Joe Cook, and this Paine guy that were doing any research and writing. So she pretty much worked for us, and I could see that she was a jewel. She did become emancipated the next year when she became married. But then I asked her if she wanted to come downtown to the private firm when we had an opening, and she said yes, because UT paid almost nothing. And so then she came to the Edgerton firm for a number of years, And then along about the mid-1980s, I would say, I had so many irons in the fire with seminars and just some stuff I was doing with the state bar and bar review, which I did a lot of by that time. So I needed somebody to work just for me. So at that time, she became employed and was able to work out of her home office. And that's the way the arrangement's been ever since. So she never was employed by the Paine Tarwater firm, which broke off and was formed sort of late 1980s.
So Karen is your legal secretary today?
Yes, Karen Holden Roberts is her name today.
And she's been your legal secretary the entire time you've been in private practice?
She's my lifelong, as far as my professional life, she's my lifelong secretary. That's what I refer to, and my best friend.
Don, how important is it to have a good legal secretary?
Absolutely essential, absolutely essential. I say in the presence of all of you and on this tape, to anybody who watches this someday, I could not have accomplished anywhere near the things I've been fortunate enough to accomplish without her, period. So it's just absolutely essential. And I tell these folks, including some of my law partners who don't listen very carefully, that you need to find, it was, in my case, it was just sort of dropped in my lap, so I didn't have to go on a great search or something, but you need to find a good and skillful secretary, and you need to have a nice compliment when compliments are deserved. And third, you need to pay well a good secretary. And that's the third part. It's what a lot of lawyers don't want to hear. But that also is important. So anyway, it's just, it's essential. I would rather have Karen than several lawyers working for me. She's worth more than several lawyers to me.
Don, back to your early days with Edgerton McAfee, what were some of the cases that you were involved in that were of particular interest to you?
Yeah, two came to mind back when you and I were first contemplating some of the things we might get into here, so I'll try to be brief about it. One was a pro bono case and one was not. There was a Ms. McCarty who walked into my office one day with a whole bunch of paperwork and said she had some kind of case. I don't know what got her sent to me. I have no idea whether Legal Aid Center or the referral service from the Knoxville bar. Somehow she just came up in my office there and plops down with all this paperwork, says she's got this case under the interstate compact. I had utterly no idea what she was talking about. But her two daughters, one daughter of her two daughters had been mysteriously taken away up in Chicago years ago by the welfare people up there, the Child Services Department. Her husband had died, so they left one daughter with her and took the daughter just slightly older. They were both quite young at the time, and took the older daughter away. And Ms. McCarty was hard of hearing. She had some genetic defect, and apparently her late husband had that too. So it turns out the two daughters could not hear at all because of, you know, this bloodline. And she was trying to get this other daughter back from up there. And I guess the other daughter now was about 13 or something like that. So I started looking into it and figured out, you know, what interstate compact it was. And I worked with the welfare department here. Mike Hutchison, the late Mike Hutchison, who later became a referee at juvenile court, a wonderful person. He over there helped me because it looked to him like there had been an injustice of having this, for no, you know, stated reason, just taken away from the mother. And she'd been dropped around in foster homes. You know how good that is for young kids. So they worked with me, and even he put one of his ladies sort of on the case to help me. I got the people in Nashville, the welfare people over there, child services people on my side. A wonderful lady from Maryville College just volunteered her time. She was an interpreter who could do the sign language, which we needed in this case. I convinced the people in Springfield, Illinois that there had been an injustice, had them on my side, and had, then I thought the people there in Cook County in Chicago convinced that we needed to take care of this thing. And this young lady was going to be flown down here about a couple of days before Christmas on a given year. Well, I get a phone call about a week before that from Springfield. Someone up there, I don't remember, I don't want to remember her name. Some lawyer type, and just said, this gal's not coming to Tennessee. We've changed our mind. And I remember I was sitting there and saying, well, you're going to have a nice Christmas, I'm sure. Ms. McCarty won't have a nice Christmas because of this. But she may have picked on the wrong country lawyer this time. I hung up the phone. And of course, I thought, what the hell are you going to do about it now? You know, that's tough talk. So we didn't talk to my agent. He said, well, we can't have people treating our firm like that. So go after it. And I did. And I didn't know anybody except 2 bar review teachers who weren't practitioners in Chicago. But I barely knew Albert Jenner, who was a giant in the profession, maybe the best trial lawyer in his heyday in the United States. And we had been on a panel together because he was head of the Federal Rules of Evidence Committee, and he'd come to Knoxville once, and I was involved in a seminar where I was actually on the same platform with him. And I called him up and told him I had this case, there wasn't any money in it, totally pro bono, and needed some help, and he at least acted like he remembered me. I'm sure he didn't. But he told me, yeah, Don, come on up here. I'll put a couple of my lieutenants on this case, and we'll help you. So we fought that case in the bowels of the juvenile court system in Chicago, and it was frustrating because he kept getting continuances and stuff, and having to fly up there with all these helpers, my lady from Maryville College, my lady from the welfare department here. And anyway, we finally got it to trial, and I and these 2 wonderful folks, Jeff Coleman, Tom Lindley, were helping me on that thing. And one story came out of it, at least I was told later, they had a law clerk they sent out to call Karen about some information that we needed in the trial. And I don't know, this may be apocryphal, it was relayed to me that Karen, she always called me her boss. When spending time with us, she'll see who the boss is. But anyway, that's her term for me. She said, well, how's my boss doing? And there was this shrink up there, the so-called expert, that spent about 5 minutes talking to this young lady over there, the subject of the custody, before the hearing started, and then got up there based on 5 minutes, never had met that young lady before, and espoused all these opinions. So I took him on cross, and I think the law clerk told Karen that, well, Karen, as we speak, your boss is kicking a shrink's ass all over the courtroom. And so we won that case, and I walked out, and I always call Karen after a trial, win or lose, because she wants to know how it did. And as soon as she answered the phone, I just started crying. I've never done that before, because I was just so wrought up with emotion, you know. But we didn't win the case, got the little girl back, and I followed up on it after everybody was back in Knoxville for several years, and as best I know, it was a happy ending for everybody. So that was one case. The other one, just one anecdote from it, we had a case right over here next door in federal court before the Honorable Robert Love Taylor. And don't want to spend the entire rest of the interview talking about Judge Taylor's stories, but he was a character, as any Knoxville lawyer of any years in practice knows. But he was trying a case down there that I was involved in. Dwight, who I had just hired recently, I think, out of law school. But
Dwight Tarwater.
Dwight Tarwater, I'm sorry, my current partner here. But I gave him some things to do. Harry Ogden was with us at the time, and he had some things. And I was really about third chair because I had just had some cancer surgery I was recuperating from. But I did, I think, take on, it was an asbestos case, a death case, mesothelioma. So very, very serious case, and one that our client was left alone. Everybody else settled out. And so we were in there by ourselves. the late Mike Rowland, bless his soul, and they brought in Ron Motley, who was supposed to be the hot dog for plaintiffs, lawyers, and asbestos. They brought him in to teach us a lesson. But anyway, it was supposed to be the unwinnable case, but I think I took on their expert. I know I put on our expert and direct examine, and then I did the closing, a very short closing. And it's the only trial that Karen ever witnessed, the only time she ever saw me in the courtroom. And I didn't even know she was out there. It's a good thing because I'd have been so nervous. But I think she did actually at least see my closing argument. And we ended up winning that case miraculously, because they couldn't pin our product to the exposure of the deceased. And Dwight gets most of the credit on that because he cross-examined the only witness that attempted to nail us with exposure, and Dwight did a good job of cross-examining him. But anyway, I remember Dwight reminded me of this. He said he's thought of it often. Judge Taylor, you know, he was said, Mr. Paine, come on up here. I said, come up here to the bench a minute, you know. The jury's sitting right there hearing all this. And he says, those boys, that's when he's calling Harry Ogden and Dwight Tarwater, those boys back there, they're not acting right. I said, you go back there and tell them to start acting right and so forth. And I said, yes, Shotter. I kind of went back, you know, and whispered to Harry and Dwight. I said, y'all just keep on what you've been doing. And Dwight said that made an impression on him. Just keep on doing what you've been doing. Because they were doing a good job, despite Judge Taylor's ire. So those were two cases that sort of stuck in my mind.
Don, I understand there was a time that you were just sitting in the back in the courtroom during a motion argument, and Judge Taylor called on you to comment. Do you recall that?
He did. I remember all these. He wanted me to kind of give my view on what the law was, and I had to stand up, and I'm just back there in the audience waiting for whatever I had to do down there that day on some completely different case. And these lawyers on each side that are just glaring at me, you know, back there about don't you dare mess up my case. So I sort of gave this wishy-washy, you know, could be this, could be that. So I wasn't disrespectful to the judge, but I didn't want to jeopardize either side of the case because he shouldn't have asked me to comment anyway, for crying out loud.
Don, what is it about the trial experience that is attractive to you?
I always enjoy that. Again, it gives me a chance to use evidence and procedure. And there's some excitement to it. And occasionally you can do some good for folks.
Is there a particular part of a trial that you like best?
I never thought I was very good at the voir dire. Just never thought I had much ability on that. I enjoyed just direct cross-examination, closing arguments, you know. So, but I just enjoy trying lawsuits. And I guess, Howard, it would be hard to think of a civil. I did only civil. As you know, in this town, you usually gravitate to civil law or criminal law. A few exceptions back in the early days of my practice, but not many. And just so happened, because of the firm I went with, I was on the civil side of things exclusively, although I'd done a little bit of criminal in the service. But it just always seemed to me to be some excitement in trial work.
Your comment on voir dire, was that in part because Judge Taylor never would let us do it?
No, I just never, in state court or whatever. Oh, what I was going to say a while ago, I lost track of thought. It would be hard to think of a type of civil case that I was not involved in at one time. And I was fortunate in that, and maybe because I was with the Edgerton firm, where a lot of the litigation I had was spun off from their corporate banking estate practice. For example, did a lot of securities regulation trials, antitrust trials, but I also did, you know, general sessions work, domestic relations, you name it. There's just not much in the way of a civil cause of action that I have not been involved with at one time or another in the 40-some years that I was involved in trial practice.
Let's go back to your family. You and Cynthia have children.
Yes, we were told in the service that we would not be able to have children, and so we should consider adopting. So we did. A little while after we came back into civilian life, we adopted Franklin, my son, Franklin Simpson Paine. And then you've probably heard this story before. It wasn't too long after, and he was only 4 days old when we got him at the hospital. So then, of course, guess what? Cynthia turns up pregnant, the person who was not supposed to become pregnant. And so we had then Emily Alexander Paine, and they're only a year and 3/4 apart. So pretty close in age, and those are our two children.
What does Franklin do now?
Okay, he is the manager of Ash's package store, Ash's Wine and Spirits, I think they call it. A great expert on wines. I should brag on him a little bit there. And then Emily works with the police department in Oak Ridge. She's one of the several people there in charge of the 911 facility within the headquarters, and she is married to a police sergeant on the force in Knoxville, Jim Settlemeyer. And then my son, it looks like in October, is going to marry Colleen, so I will now have 4 children, looks like pretty quickly. So that's my tribe. I've got my sister I've told you about. Cynthia, even though we were divorced many years ago, we stayed very good friends. I always really considered her my wife. And the sad thing is she, in her, I guess, early to mid-50s, at least that's when the children and I first were able to notice that she developed early onset Alzheimer's, which is not something you want to sell anybody. And so I had to sell the house where she lived. By that time, the kids had moved out. She was living in a big old house alone. I moved her in an apartment near mine, a couple of doors down, for several years. Then it went from there to intermediate care because this disease only goes in one direction. And that worked for a number of years, and then finally we had to resort to Little Creek Sanitarium, and they were wonderful folks to take care of her in her late in her life. So she did pass several years ago. So she's no longer with us.
Don, there came a time in your history with the Edgerton firm where you left with some other members of the firm to form another firm. How did that happen?
Okay. Dwight Tarwater in particular had been wanting to make a move. I did not think I would be able to, even though I had some dissatisfaction by that time, because I had developed cancer by then, and assumed I'd have to keep my medical insurance coverage through the Edgerton firm. But once when Dwight and I were in Nashville on some legal matter, we were driving back. I remember exactly where it was. If you know the 2 rest stops nearest Crab Orchard before you come down off the plateau there, we were driving east, just beyond the east-bound rest stop. Kind of when you come down that hill, and right over there is the rest stop for the westbound traffic. And I remember saying something to him about, well, Dwight, if you can figure out a way to get me covered for medical insurance, which obviously I've got to have, I'll make the break with you. And he just about ran off the interstate. I won't repeat his salty language that he used, but anyway, from there, I suggested to him that he ought to talk to Mike Swinney. And so the 3 of us formed that firm in the living room of my apartment one evening.
Now, Mike Sweeney's gone on to the bench.
He's on the Court of Appeals, yes, a very distinguished judge on that court, but those were the three original partners. I was frankly always an inactive partner, but I was in the firm name because they insisted on it. But I didn't, by that time I had the Tennessee Law Institute seminar business built up. And as I say, I was doing an awful lot of, about half of the bar review by that time, I guess, under Bob Crosley. So I had sufficient income where I didn't need to take income out of Paine, Swinney, and Tarwater. But I did have to be insured, because and somehow they, I don't know how they ever did it, somehow they got me insured by Blue Cross Blue Shield. So that was the genesis of that firm, of the present firm.
You have remained a teacher throughout the entire time of your private practice. Why?
Most of the time I have, yeah. I just enjoyed doing some part-time teaching. I like being with the students. Always learn something myself. It's these folks that are looking through the first time, you know, and they're not, their mind is not clouded by a lot of other stuff they might have seen, and they'll sometimes ask you there, well, Professor, the rule really doesn't say that. You'll look at it and say, well, you know, you may be right. So, so it causes you to rethink, and sometimes you have to tell them, they ask you a good question, and I'll tell them quite frankly, I had never thought of that before. I don't know the answer. Let me get in the books and see if I can find you one. And so I just enjoy, it's just refreshing to me.
When did you become affiliated with the Crosley Bar Review course?
Oh, golly. Probably close to 1970, shortly after 1970. I did a little bit of it, and then he gave me more and more assignments till, as I say, I was finally teaching, I think, roughly 50%. But then later on, as you know, he then sold out to the national organization called Barbary. And I still do a little bit of teaching, but only three courses, so I have nowhere near the involvement in bar review that I used to have. More of my time has been spent with the Tennessee Law Institute seminars to lawyers for CLE credit, which again started back, I guess, around the 1970, 71 itself. And that had become a pretty big business. And so that was where most of my effort was directed and is directed today.
How was the TLI, Tennessee Law Institute, formed?
It was pretty much John Smart, and I interviewed him for the foundation one time in this very room. And John had this idea that we ought to have a CLE program that just sort of covered the waterfront and of developments each year, annual developments. And so we started it for a few years. It was sponsored through the Tennessee Bar Association, and then we eventually became independent as the Tennessee Law Institute. I got John Walker involved early in the history, and then at a later time, probably late 1980s, is when we brought Sarah Shepard on board to do some of the lecturing as well. So the three of us are the lecturers, and then Karen and Robin are our two full-time employees, and then Laura, and then Kara, who's Karen's daughter. Those are our two part-time employees, and really, other than our book publisher and our independent contractor, Soundman, that is the Tennessee Law Institute. A lot of members of the bar out there seem to think we have 20 or 30 research assistants working with us and so forth. We've got a research assistant.
Does that research assistant use a computer?
Doesn't use a computer, but his secretary, Karen, does. And she's very proficient at it, and all I do is read the hard copy cases and analyze them, and also obviously public acts, congressional statutes, and so forth. So it is literally a daily project to keep up with all of that, and obviously a fairly small percentage of it actually goes into the seminar handout book. It is covered in the 2 days of lectures, but somebody has got to read everything to decide what's important enough to go in there. And that's what I do.
Don, many years ago, you became involved in the evolution of our rules of civil procedure. What has been your involvement?
Well, not so much civil procedure now, because I wasn't on the commission, Rules Commission at that time. I got on, I think, a little before the time that the appellate rules were being worked on. So, and I don't remember what year that was, Howard, but the civil rules had already been adopted, as we say, back around 70, 71. And I don't know what mid to late 70s is maybe when I was put on the commission. Seemed like I spent a couple of terms over all those decades as chair briefly, but I've mainly been, for most of the time, the reporter to the commission. But I was in there during the work on the appellate rules, and of course then the rules of evidence, which was a very intensive project we had. Met monthly for several years, hammering those out. And then there was a separate group at the time that worked on the criminal rules. Now the Supreme Court has combined all jurisdiction under just one rules commission, to which I have the honor of serving as reporter. Including in the juvenile rules, there had been briefly a separate group on juvenile rules, but it's all under one umbrella right now. The Commission on Rules of Practice and Procedure, I think, somewhat close to the name of it. And we do everything now.
What are your responsibilities as the reporter for that commission?
Okay, basically just working up the agenda and, of course, the minutes, and then most important, drafting proposals based on what various of the, I think, 21 members across the state think we ought to maybe take a look at changing this, changing that. And a lot of the work right now, frankly, is just fine-tuning, because these various sets of rules have been in effect for a long time, and let's hope are workable, but we can always make some improvements from time to time. So I do essentially all of the drafting.
Has the Supreme Court called on you at times to make presentations to the legislature?
Oh yes, that's part of my duty also. I go to the legislature once a year and explain to the two judiciary committees what the court had in mind and what the commission had in mind, because as you know, it takes not only a Supreme Court order, but it also takes resolutions from each house of the legislature to make the rules effective. So I do those presentations as well.
Have you enjoyed your time working with the legislature over the years?
Enjoyed. To some extent, yes. I mean, they've, especially with time, they've gotten used to me, I suppose, and they're nice to me. But they'll still jump me from time to time, and that's okay. It teaches humility. It's good for me.
Your devotion to that aspect of your work keeps you on the interstate a lot. What do you listen to on the car radio?
On the car, well, I really pretty much these days am a fanatic on the books on tape. So or books on CD, as most of them are right now. So I've usually got that with me when I'm on the road, and I listen to a lot of history, some true crime is most of what I listen to.
Are there any particular recollections you have about the experience of being a young lawyer in the Knoxville bar legal community?
I would say that one of the heartwarming things about it was that most of the older lawyers were nice to you, helped you, were glad to give you some advice on things, treated you with respect. Very few, very few might stand out as to the contrary, but by and large, I just felt like that it was a great place to practice, is a great place to practice, and that the senior members were going to represent their clients, certainly, but they used professional courtesy toward the younger members of the bar. And I hope I did that later when I became the so-called senior member of the bar. I think I did.
Do you feel that the Knoxville legal community is the same in that respect as it was then?
Well, I think not just Knoxville legal community, I think the legal community nationwide, statewide, just because the number of lawyers has mushroomed so that we don't know each other as well. When I was first in practice, I knew every lawyer in Knoxville, most of them pretty well. And there's just not that knowledge now. And sometimes I think that causes less courtesy between lawyers. You're talking to somebody unknown to you. Whereas in the old days, you were dealing with somebody that you might be having a beer with sometime later that week.
When did you first become interested in the organized bar?
I always had some aspirations to get involved in the Bar Association. I don't know, I guess I thought right or wrong, that's something that's probably ought to make a contribution there, just like pro bono work. You know, I didn't think I was doing anything special. I just thought that goes with a law license. You got a law license, you got a duty to help some people that can't pay you a fee as well as help those that can pay a fee. So I just sort of took that as something that I would like to do eventually.
Were you active in the Young Lawyers Organization here in Knoxville, which we call the Barristers Club?
Yes, I think I was eventually maybe president of the Barristers Club.
You were also president of the Knoxville Bar Association.
I was fortunate to be elected president of the Knoxville Bar, and then later on had the privilege of serving in that capacity with the Tennessee Bar Association.
For your year as Knoxville Bar president, do you have any particular recollection about what happened that year?
Well, we had a few disciplinary problems for the almost first time. The Knoxville Bar seemed to have been in good shape ethically, at least as far as any flagrant violation, but it just so happened that year, a couple of cases I won't get into in detail, obviously, but I had to spend a good bit of time working with disciplinary counsel and investigating, helping them investigate some of these unfortunate matters. And with the Knoxville Bar, since you're right there handy, you know, for people to call or come by and bother you, really, it is fairly time-consuming to do the job right as president of the local bar association, but I still enjoyed it.
Don, I remember the day of your swearing in as president of the Knoxville Bar, your parents were there.
Mm-hmm.
Did your parents ever comment on your work as a lawyer, or did they ever offer any parental advice?
You know, I don't think they did much. I think Mother, from time to time, I guess after I became a lawyer, sort of thought maybe I was destined for that. I think she thought so because maybe I argued some when I was a kid, but liked to argue. That would have made me a lawyer. But no, I mean, I think they were proud of my accomplishments, but they never verbalized it much, which is fine. You know.
Your year as Tennessee Bar president, anything interesting happened that year?
I tried to get out with the folk more. Did an awful lot of traveling on the back roads of this state. There's most counties I got to because I felt like that there had not been in the years prior to my year enough contact with some of the rural lawyers and bar associations. So I really made it a point to try to spend an awful lot of time in some of those activities so it wouldn't just be a 4 major cities type organization or just a Nashville-centered situation. But it was an enjoyable year. I tried also to make a few changes as far as participation. I insisted that, there were very few appointments that the president could make at that time, but the ones where I did have appointment power, since I felt like there were, you know, a lot of ladies in the bar, women in the bar by that time, but not many of them were in positions in the bar. I used some of my appointment powers for a little affirmative action to appoint them. I insisted on seminar panels that we had some women and some minorities as well. I remember, I think I told you when we had lunch one day, and a respected judge who's now about to retire, Justice A. Birch, but I had told whoever was in charge of some bar seminar, check with him. And anyway, it came to my attention that he was not a member of the bar, and the executive secretary said, really on our seminars, panels, that people are supposed to be members of the bar. So I picked up the phone and called His Honor. I think he was on the intermediate court at that time, not the Supreme Court, and just wondered if he could join up because of this rule. And he said, Dottie said it wasn't too long ago that even if I'd wanted to, I couldn't have been a member of the Tennessee Bar Association. I said, Your Honor, you're right about that, and I'm ashamed that that was right, but it's not true anymore. And he was a good sport and joined up. But anyway, but we, I think, made some progress that year and got some involvement from some constituencies that seemed to have been left out. And I caught some flack about it, frankly, but I didn't care.
Don, why was it important to you to place some emphasis on women and minority involvement during your year as president?
Well, I just, thought we ought to be fair. I don't think it ought to be all that lopsided one way, but it just seemed to me that it had been just such a uniform situation for years and years, and I didn't think that was proper. This is a bar association for the lawyers of Tennessee, not just for the white male lawyers.
Do you recall who was on the Board of Governors with you during your year as TBA president?
Oh, golly. I'm embarrassed to say I probably really can't. I mean, obviously, Woody Sims, who was my predecessor, was still on there. Seemed like Emmett Marston was. Jim Emerson, who succeeded me, would have been on there. I think Jack Wheeler, who later became president down the road, I'm pretty sure Jack was on the board, but I just, I don't remember.
Now, speaking of being a member of the bar, is there an interesting story about you applying for practice before the United States Supreme Court?
Yeah, it was pretty embarrassing. There was some case that Dwight Tarwater and I had. It was probably an asbestos case. I know it was a products case. And most time we somehow lucked up and won at the trial level. But then we go to the Sixth Circuit, and the Sixth Circuit just seemed to have a way of reversing all the time. So Dwight decided he would actually apply for certiorari to the United States Supreme Court, and did so. And my name would have been on there as lead counsel, and some call came back in here, they can't find this guy Paine is a lawyer in the state of Tennessee. Well, it turned out, I told you Federal Judge Taylor swore me in right before I reported for active duty. I didn't know, and I'm told that some other military people had this happen to them too. I didn't realize when I came back to civilian life that I was supposed to go before the Supreme Court of Tennessee and take the oath that's in the statute books that you're supposed to take, otherwise you're guilty of the unauthorized practice of law. So anyway, so I just overlooked that. And I'd been practicing for a number of years then, and so I think I called up Justice Harbison. He was the liaison with our Rules Commission, so I had known him for a long time anyway.
And you were reporter for the Rules Commission at this time?
I think so, and I told him I had this little embarrassment here. Anyway, they fixed it somehow that they nunc-pro-tunked retroactively an order. I think they just arbitrarily found some reported case. It was the first reported case that had my name on it, and nunc-pro-tunked me back so that I was not guilty of unauthorized practice of law. And then, of course, our certiorari petition, once we got that little glitch worked out, I think it was denied by return mail.
Don, how has the Knoxville legal community changed over the years?
I don't know, except size, and what I said a while ago would be about my only comment, that we just don't know each other personally, and that probably takes away from some of the professionalism. But again, the bar, see, I'm pretty much out of the action right now, and I do think based on reading the publication dicta of the Knoxville Bar Association, I think they're certainly making a lot of efforts to get various groups together and to reinstill some of the friendship amongst lawyers. But it just, the size, I just think inevitably has made a difference in the way attitude.
Why don't we take a few minutes break?